In this video, we're going to be looking at the top 10 best Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon cards ever to be released. Make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you have not done so already, as it does in fact help both parties out a lot. So number 10 on this list goes to Man-Eater Bug. Man-Eater Bug was for quite a while one of the better flip effect monsters to be released. Although the card nowadays has almost no useful aspect at all, I'm simply putting this on here because, well, for one, Blue Eyes White Dragon cards are actually pretty bad in general, so kind of by default, but also for its really historical and iconic presence in the past of the trading card game. Man-Eater Bug was just simply such a huge threat in the initial stages of Yu-Gi-Oh! That a lot of people simply would not attack a face-down defense position monster because they would assume it's a Man-Eater Bug that could essentially wipe out their huge beater at the time. There was another card that got released that had identical stats and a very similar effect known as Old Vindictive Magician, but eventually the card got power crept by a much better card known as RAIGEKI Lightsworn Hunter. This card also had a flip, and in exchange for a few less stats, it had a much better effect that would let you actually destroy any one card on the field as opposed to just a monster, and it would also mill out 3 cards from your deck, which in most cases is actually better than worse. However, for these reasons previously mentioned, this is ultimately why this card is number 10 on this list, simply because it did have a very significant impact on the game early on. Number 9 on this list is Trap Hole. So Trap Hole was also a deadly card when it first came out. Essentially, if a monster your opponent summons has 1000 or more attack, it's destroyed by this card. There are some catches though. For one, the card only works on normal and flip summon monsters, not special summons. Because of this reason, early on in Yu-Gi-Oh! Trap Hole is actually a pretty good card, because the majority of summons were either normal or flips. Special summons were quite rare indeed. Eventually, the card got almost completely power crept by a better Trap Hole known as Bottomless Trap Hole, which only had one downside compared to Trap Hole, being that the monster must have at least 1500 or more attack, thus making it harder to activate the guidelines and conditions for the card. However, in exchange for that, the card would actually also include special summoning, and also the special summoning of monsters at the same time. So if your opponent special summoned a bunch of monsters with one effect, they would all be destroyed by Bottomless Trap Hole. In addition, it would banish the card instead of sending it to the graveyard, which in most cases is actually a much better option. Still though, Trap Hole had a very heavy and significant presence early on in Yu-Gi-Oh! And because of that, it finds itself on the number 9 of this list. The number 8 spot goes to FISSURE. FISSURE was one of those cards that, when it first came out, was really good obviously, but it actually stayed pretty good for quite a number of years, unlike Trap Hole and Man-Eater Bug that got power crept fairly early on. FISSURE's effect says that it destroys one monster that the opponent controls with the lowest attack on the field, essentially only working on a face-up monster. Due to the wording of this card, what's really unique about it is that initially it seems like it does target, but it actually does not. FISSURE is a non-targeting spell card that destroys a monster. This makes it bypass monsters that are immune to targeting, although it does destroy, so it doesn't bypass monsters that are immune to destruction. Still though, it's actually really good even compared to other similar cards like Hammer Shot, which would work on the highest attack position monster, but on the whole field plus including your own, which is why FISSURE was still better than this card. There was a similar card known as Smashing Ground that eventually was released, and for a while, it was debated among which card was actually better, FISSURE or Smashing Ground. Both of these cards found themselves on the limited list for quite a while, with FISSURE eventually being removed from the limited list before Smashing Ground, but Smashing Ground still having a significant impact. Regardless though, it's pretty interesting that this card was in competition with Smashing Ground, a card that came out several sets later, with FISSURE being the first set ever to be released. This makes FISSURE a very iconic and really interesting and intriguing card for many people, and that's why this card is on the number 8 of this list, because of its pure power in combination with its iconic presence once again. The number 7 spot on this list goes to Blue Eyes White Dragon. Among vanilla monsters to eventually have archetypes on this set, there's actually 4 big ones, known as Blue Eyes White Dragon, Dark Magician, Red Eyes Black Dragon, and Gaia the Fierce Knight. Most people would agree that Gaia the Fierce Knight is the worst of these 4 archetypes, while Blue Eyes White Dragon is the best of these 4 archetypes. Dark Magician and Red Eyes are actually pretty good archetypes, but not nearly as useful as Blue Eyes White Dragon. All 4 of these monsters do require 2 tributes for a tribute summon, and Blue Eyes White Dragon has the best stats as well as the best archetype utilization. Ultimately, this makes Blue Eyes the best of these 4 and really the best vanilla of the entire set here, because a lot of other cards are honestly really bad vanillas. Regardless though, it's clear that Blue Eyes eventually just made itself to a very formidable archetype with so many support cards and so many crazy combinations that really I just have to include this card here on this list because it really is a really good card. On its own, not so much, but with support, it's amazing. Number 6 on this list goes to Polymerization. Despite Polymerization being a very simple fusion summon card, strangely enough, it actually still has some use today. It's really only mostly used on archetypes and decks that don't have their own fusion card. There are certain archetypes that actually already have their own amazing special summoning conditions for fusion summons, such as Miracle Fusion and so on and so forth, but Polymerization is still the go-to solid card for those types of decks that simply don't have access to an alternative card. Because of this, decks rely on it, and because it's relied on so much, it technically still makes it a good card because it's used so much even on meta decks nowadays. Polymerization is simply one of those cards that's just always going to be useful and relevant almost no matter what, because it's the basic go-to card that's just so flexible and works well. It's not amazing on its own, but it's kind of what decks have to resort to. Number 5 goes to EXODIA the Forbidden One, and technically speaking the other 4 pieces alongside it. It's really intriguing that a card with an alternative win condition was, first of all, released on the very first set of Yu-Gi-Oh!, but also, approximately 18 years later, the card still has a lot of use and it's still really good. There's been numerous cards released since the release of EXODIA that also have alternative win conditions, and most of them are really not all that great simply because they're just very too specific and difficult to actually bring out, too convoluted in so many cases that it's just really bad. EXODIA though is a very good definition of something that is technically hard to do, but it's very consistent because it works with so many decks. So due to the flexibility and versatility of EXODIA in its historical aspect, as well as even nowadays being a pretty good card still, that's ultimately why this card finds itself on the number 5 of this list. The number 4 on this list goes to Dark Hole. So Dark Hole, alongside a better version of it, which is obviously higher up on this list, which we'll get to in just a little bit, is obviously a very good card. Now, it wasn't until actually very recently where Dark Hole finally came off the ban list for good. For the longest time, it was on the limited list, going to semi-limited, limited again, and so on and so forth, until finally it was completely off. For a span of over a decade, this card just simply found itself on the ban list, and for a very good reason. On activation, it destroys all monsters on the field. Despite it destroying your own cards, in most cases you would really only activate Dark Hole if you really had no monsters on your field, or if you had monsters that actually benefited from being sent to the graveyard, such as having destruction effects or floating effects. So this in most cases actually made Dark Hole hurt your opponent a lot more than yourself. And due to its just very flexible staple and powerful like effect, that's really why Dark Hole found itself on the list of so many decks, because a huge amount of decks could actually play this card really effectively with no issues whatsoever. Number 3 on this list goes to Monster Reborn. Monster Reborn is simply the definition of a reborning card from the graveyard. Essentially all it says is to target one monster on either player's graveyard and special summon it. And that's it. It's not a hard once per turn, it doesn't have limitations for the rest of the turn, and so on and so forth. And part of the reason why is because the card was released in Legend of Blue Eyes when those types of limitations weren't actually implemented into cards. Nowadays, special summoning and storming the field is honestly one of the better effects to utilize. In many cases you could argue it's better than pure destruction of the opponent's cards. Simply because if you special summon a monster, not only are you putting more presence on the field with the monster, but you're also bringing in a monster with really good effects. If you look at cards nowadays that revive from the graveyard or the deck or anything like that, you'll see that they typically have limitations that either says the card cannot attack this turn or the card cannot activate its effects this turn, and so on and so forth. Monster Reborn doesn't have that. If you special summon a monster, that monster can attack on the same turn, and it can use its effects, and it can be used as material, and it can be tributed, etc, etc. That's ultimately why the card is so flexible and so good, and nowadays, it's still limited. Historically, the card has found itself on the forbidden list, back to limited, just back and forth. Right now it's limited, but honestly, I would not be completely shocked if it just keeps bouncing back and forth because it's just that good of a card. And that's why this card finds itself on the number 3 spot on this list. The number 2 spot on this list goes to RAIGEKI. RAIGEKI is basically a better version of Dark Hole. The card says destroys all monsters your opponent controls, as opposed to all monsters on the field. So yes, it's definitely a just pure better version of Dark Hole, simply because it only works on your opponent's monsters. And this card actually is still on the limited list, unlike Dark Hole, simply because it is a better card. That's not to say that RAIGEKI is overall an overpowered card for being limited, it's not. In many cases you could actually argue that Monster Reborn, despite me placing it on number 3, should actually be higher than RAIGEKI. You can make an argument back and forth, but in many cases RAIGEKI just has a pure direct better advantage in terms of card advantage for you, because it can potentially destroy up to 6 monsters your opponent controls, whereas Monster Reborn brings back 1, which yes, it could then lead to more monsters, but it's kind of a step-by-step indirect basis, whereas RAIGEKI, in terms of looking at the card itself, technically does provide more card advantage, generally speaking. That's ultimately why I put RAIGEKI at number 2 over Monster Reborn, but again, you can make an argument either or. And finally, the number 1 spot goes to Pot of Greed. So Pot of Greed is a card that actually has a very confusing effect, to the point where nobody really knows what the card does. So it says draw 2 cards. Now I know that's confusing, but basically what the card does is that it lets you get 2 cards from the top of your deck and put them onto your hand. That's the best way to explain it. Okay, so I just have to say all that because of memes on the internet, but jokes aside, obviously Pot of Greed is a fantastic card and it's forbidden. For good reason. Out of the entire list of these 10 cards in Legend of Blue Eyes, Pot of Greed is the only card among all of these that has actually been on the forbidden list ever since it first got put there. The only other cards that have made themselves to the forbidden list have been RAIGEKI, Monster Reborn, and Dark Hole, but those cards either go back and forth or just eventually got removed. Pot of Greed is still forbidden, and probably will always still forbidden, unless it gets errated, which I really doubt. You see, in Yu-Gi-Oh! The value of a card is really ultimately measured by how much card advantage you get versus your opponent, and also how simplistic it is to reach that card advantage. There are some cards that can get you +1 or +2, but they take a lot of combos and a long process. Thus, it's more balanced, and usually those kinds of cards find themselves on the semi-limited or limited list because they're just that good. Cards that are just so simple to reach that advantage usually find themselves on the forbidden list. Pot of Greed is a very prime example of that. The reason why these kinds of cards work much better in Yu-Gi-Oh! As opposed to other games like Pokemon or Magic the Gathering is because there's not really a resource required in Yu-Gi-Oh! And things that limit you from actually activating certain effects, and things that have a once per turn clause unless a card specifically says so. Ultimately, this is why Pot of Greed is number 1 on this list, and rightfully so. So that was the entire list of the top 10 best cards of Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon. As always, let me know what you think about this list, if you agree, disagree, and as always, make sure that you leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you have not done so already, and I will see all of you in the next one. Bye bye everyone, have a great and of course a fantastic day.